and I am really looking forward to spending time with all of you today to discuss the importance of the Ombudsman institution that we all hold so dear, to discuss the challenges we face and the methods and the tools that we can use to meet those challenges. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional Indigenous territories on which we are privileged to live and work here in Ontario. These are the traditional territories of more than 130 First Nations, each with distinct cultures, languages, and histories. And we recognize that Indigenous peoples who have stewarded these lands for millennia have been subjected to dispossession and colonial injustices, and we remain committed to supporting efforts to address both historic and ongoing harms. So today's International Meeting of the Minds comes at a particularly meaningful moment for us here in Ontario. The year 2025 marks our 50th anniversary, a milestone that invites both celebration and reflection on 5 decades of service to the people of Ontario. So since 1975, our office has handled more than 1 million individual complaints, conducted hundreds of investigations, and issued over 1,300 recommendations. And through this work, we've helped public sector bodies improve their services, reduce barriers, and make changes that have really benefited millions of people. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say that the Ombudsman is a vital democratic institution, one that strengthens public sector governance and promotes transparency and administrative fairness. And as the Chief Justice of Ontario reminded us recently, the Ombudsman institution also reinforces the rule of law. At a reception that we hosted here in our office a couple of weeks ago to celebrate the 50th anniversary, Chief Justice Michael Tulloch said this. He said, "The rule of law is not sustained by courts alone. It lives in how a benefits claim is processed, how a complaint is answered, how discretion is used, how reasons are given, and how mistakes are addressed. In that sense, the Ombudsman extends the rule of law beyond the courtroom, ensuring that public power is exercised fairly, transparently, and with restraint." So today's session will explore the challenges facing our offices and the ways that we can overcome them to continue our important contributions to society. And I really hope that the agenda that we've put together will spark some stimulating discussions about our role in promoting procedural fairness, protecting rights, and evolving to meet the demands of these complex times to ensure that citizens continue to have a strong, robust mechanism of oversight. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this symposium, Nadine Mailloux, president of the International Ombudsman Institute, ombudsman for the City of Montreal, and a leading voice in the ombudsman community. A lawyer, accredited mediator, and seasoned practitioner with more than 25 years' experience, Nadine has served in some of Quebec's most complex public institutions, including Montreal's Health Network and as the City of Laval Ombudsman. She's a dedicated educator, co-directing and teaching in several ombudsman training programs across Canada, and I'm very proud to call her my friend. Nadine, we're honored to have you with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our first speaker. And so thank you, everybody. Enjoy the symposium.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Paul, for that warm introduction. I am delighted to be here with you this afternoon in what I essentially consider a gathering of friends and valued colleagues from across Canada and the globe, taking a few hours to not only engage in discussion, but also mark the 50th anniversary of a flagship office in Canadian ombudsmanship, and its current holder, my friend Paul Dubé. And I want to take 1 minute to underline that Paul's influence, stature, and dedication will undoubtedly leave a lasting mark on our field, and his legacy will live on well beyond the end of his term. I therefore take this opportunity to officially thank him and to express how much his approach has served our profession. Your thoughtful and deliberate perspective on coherent intervention is matched only by the generosity you continue to show to our community. Now then, back to earth. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items to keep in mind. All presentations will be delivered in English, and you'll have the French translation a little bit further on the line. You'll be hearing from two panels of speakers today. In the interest of time, questions and discussion will be left to the end of each panel. You can submit questions for our panelists at any time by clicking the Q&A button in the top right of your screen. Also, to give our speakers as much time as possible, I invite you to consult their biographies. You received the link. I'll then keep the introductions brief. Finally, just a quick note to let you know that I have a cold today, so my slightly shaky voice is due to congestion. Thank you for your understanding. So starting us off today is another friend, Sir Rob Behrens, who is the former UK Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, as some of you, of course, may know. He will provide us with introductory remarks. Rob has written extensively on the role and the importance of the Ombudsman's role. His global experience and perspective, but also his sharp intellect and quintessentially British wit, make him the ideal candidate to kick us off today. Thank you, Rob, for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Greetings from a cold, wet and windy London. I hope you can hear me despite the rain. I'm grateful for this invitation to speak at the 50th anniversary celebration before such an illustrious group of speakers and participants. One of the most important things we need to do is to talk to each other about the difficult things in a lonely profession. So this is a wonderful opportunity to do so. As a former national ombudsman and as a former member of the World Board of the International Ombudsman Institute, I can testify to the very high esteem the Ontario Ombudsman Office is held in my country and throughout the world. There are a number of reasons for this. First, as Nadine has already set out, because of the respect and affection Paul Dubé is held in by all Ombudsman colleagues. Paul is an exemplary Ombudsman, trenchant, strategic, collegiate, generous, and focused on the interest of his own organisation, its staff, and most important, the people who use your services. Paul has continued the fine tradition of Canadian Ombuds colleagues in focusing on some very key issues that some of us miss. One is the key issue of professional development. And coming to Canada on many occasions is an exciting opportunity to refresh and learn in a way which doesn't happen in a number of other countries. Also, the importance of human rights and linguistic equality, in which you have led the way, and the wider responsibilities of an ombuds leader, which I want to come on to. Together with Jay Chalk and new IOI President Nadine Mailloux, Paul has made a substantial contribution to the IOI's decisive response to the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and also in addition to ensuring integrity is the principal characteristic of IOI office holders. There's no point in us going round telling people to behave if we don't behave ourselves. We live in dark and dangerous times. There's no ombudsman golden age that we can refer to. And as you move into your next 50 years, we have to rely on the cherished principles that ombudsmen use of independence, transparency, and impartiality. It was Nora Farrell who long ago introduced me to the idea of structural impartiality, the idea that there's no point in people of common views and the same demographic coming together to agree and to confirm their prejudices. And in the face of the new authoritarianism in politics, this is very important that we're self-critical and look at the principles of how we operate. We all need the living coherence of the Venice Principles and the expert judgments of the Venice Commission. I hope you will not be reluctant to call upon this body, as I had to do, to consolidate your authority and any threat from adverse legislative or other changes. Speaking truth unto power requires the use of powerful allies where necessary. In terms of leadership principles, what the new authoritarianism means is that we have to balance our strategic focus with a heightened emphasis on granularity, where we can demonstrate our compassion, our empathy, and even our outrage. When I was interviewed on television about a case finding where a young boy died in hospital in the face of 19 instances of service failure and maladministration, and the deliberate falsification of his medical record after he died, the interviewer said to me, "You're very angry, aren't you? We don't see a lot of that amongst public officials." And I wondered whether to be sorry and apologetic or to think that was the right disposition to have. And I conclude that occasionally anger is a natural and acceptable behavior where the alternative is bland indifference to injustice. In any event, through granularity, we can continue to tell stories where our case intervention has helped to change or save people's lives. It's still the case, and this was shown during the IOI research survey during COVID, that most people around the world don't yet understand what an ombudsman does and what potential we have for changing lives. Telling stories is a vital way of imprinting what we do on people's hearts in a transparent way. Finally, in the context of growing authoritarianism, we need to focus on collegiality and resilience in everything that we do. Collegiality to continue to support colleagues under threat across the world as well as in North America. And resilience because sometimes slow wins are even more important than quick wins. And the political cycle requires patience, determination, and political astuteness with a small p, and we should remember that. Changing administrative cultures sometimes takes decades, not weeks or months. And we need to remember that there will be magnificent colleagues to follow us and hold the candle for justice and fairness when we have finished. I look forward to listening and learning, and I wish you well in the struggles ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob, for being here today, and I could not agree more. Never be indifferent. Keep sometimes being angry, keep sometimes being surprised and question things. It's very refreshing to hear. We'll now proceed for our first panel of speakers, titled Issues in Complaint Handling. This panel, featuring 4 of our distinguished guests, will cover topics such as communication, technology, people management, and efficiency. First up, speaking on proactive communication and managing expectations, is that David Paradiso, Deputy Ombudsperson for the Canadian province of British Columbia. David has over 35 years of experience in oversight and investigation. Excuse me. Having dealt with complaints in a variety of public sector topics, such as corrections, policy, policing, and social benefits. On a more personal note, he exemplifies the quiet yet powerful excellence that defines the best in our profession. He also sits on the Forum of Canadian Ombudsman Board. David, thank you for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Nadine. Good day from the Office of the British Columbia Ombudsperson. It is important to me to acknowledge that I am speaking today from our office located in the city that we settlers call Victoria, which is in fact situated on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. I make this acknowledgement to affirm my personal commitment to reconciliation. It is with humility that I make my remarks on the same panel as these accomplished Canadian ombuds, for whom I have the highest regard. And I am deeply grateful to Paul Dubé for honoring me with the privilege of participating in this symposium, commemorating his office's 50th anniversary. Thank you. I remember in 1989, 36 years ago, sitting in an auditorium in my law school, listening in astonishment to an address by an earlier Ontario Ombudsman. I believe we have all had that same moment of astonishment when we first learned that there was an organization that would listen to complaints about public service delivery and investigate them for the sole purpose of improving the delivery of those services. I was elated to later be selected to complete my articles in the legal department of Ombudsman Ontario, and I have not looked back. You can see from the title of my presentation that I'm speaking a little about what I have learned about being proactive with complainants in this work. On the next slide, there is the legitimate question, why? There is certainly nothing wrong with being reactive. However, I have found that the benefits of a proactive approach to be many. Principal among them is efficiency. When your office takes control of the dialogue, it reduces the delay in waiting for those questions to arise. Rather than having to answer a variety of different questions that might occur to a complainant at different times, a proactive communication provides answers to the most common questions before the complainant even thinks about them. Instead of guessing the information that any specific complainant might need at different times, proactive communication gives them more than they need to know from the very beginning. They may not retain all of the information, but if we later provide an explanation referring back to the initial message, it often jogs their memory and better leads to acceptance. I'm not sure that slide has appeared yet, but if you can move it to that slide, there's just a couple of highlights there. And this leads to the second major benefit. It builds trust. By explaining as much as possible, as early as possible, we avoid the complainant later being taken by surprise. We demonstrate reason and consistency, two essential components for building trust. Trust is best established during the early rapport, when we are merely listening, collecting information, and are still viewed as impartial. If we haven't established trust in those circumstances, a complainant is unlikely to trust us once we have taken a position and are delivering a conclusion in opposition to the complaint. Ultimately, proactive communication puts our staff in the driver's seat. By telling the complainant what information is required of them, we control the information we receive and the flow of that information. We create an isolated space to conduct our investigations. Clear early communication eliminates any mystery, which reduces anxiety, which reduces the chances of emotional escalation. Staff are more efficient, less prone to numerous untimely questions, and less vulnerable to unfair criticism from complainants. On the next slide, I will turn to the methods used. I think of them under three distinct activities. To begin, engage. Make efforts to be the first to reach out after receipt of the complaint. This acknowledgement shows respect for the individual bringing the complaint, and it demonstrates our appreciation for their effort. It needn't be elaborate, little more than a brief message from one human to another, recognizing them and establishing a rapport. This is an ideal opportunity to determine the urgency of the matter. I have seen instant automated confirmations of receipt incorporated into office systems, which is a fine mechanism. However, it is better followed up with another message from a staff member who can round out and confirm the automated acknowledgement by simply being a human being medium for that message. The next step is to educate the complainant about the role of the office, the scope of its mandate, and its operational mechanisms. This needn't be done at the same time as the early engagement, but it could certainly follow the flow of that same conversation, if time permits. Importantly, this is the ideal moment to set expectations for both your office and of the complainant. If you have a set statement about respectful language and comportment, this is the time to set it out clearly. This is when the limits on the office's powers should be stated. This is when we set out the processes of our work, what is required of the complainant, and how they can assist us. This is also the time to be clear about next steps and any timeliness we can share with complainants. As new questions arise, we need to be sure we continue to message the same information we gave at the beginning. Once we undertake our work, we need to remember the standards for ourselves. We have to set and ensure we meet them. If timelines shift in the course of an investigation, as they commonly do, we need to remember to reach out and communicate proactively, and if possible, give the information and the reasons. A complainant will feel authentically honored if we keep them informed instead of remaining silent, which will leave them feeling that they have been forgotten. The next slide summarizes this as cadence. Consider your own processes in response to the following questions. I'll repeat and say that the summary is simply communicate early, communicate often, communicate consistently. Be the first to reach out. What is your office's acknowledgement window? Which milestones can a complainant expect an update? At the triage stage, at the records request and review stage, when the analysis is started, and of course at the outcome. But consider those milestones and consider setting them and making efforts to ensure that the complainant is aware as those steps proceed. And set standard messages. Do you have standard messages and templates that you use? So who does what? Who's responsible for which components? My next slide posits that everyone is involved. I'll begin with comms, communications, and outreach. At the coalface, mining complaints from the public at large is the outreach function. Whether it is supported by a dedicated communications team or by line staff who also deliver presentations to stakeholders and community groups, or by the head of the organization granting interviews to the media. We all take on some measure of building general public awareness. Here is where public education must strike a balance between engaging interest and setting realistic expectations. Effective efforts use accessible, plain language that also clearly states what the organization does. Those of us fortunate enough to have a dedicated outreach unit will have a regular cycle of ongoing meetings with community-serving organizations like legal clinics, immigrant settlement services, disability supports, housing advocates, and indigenous community partners. These are useful for detailing the nuances of our office's scope, sharing alternative referral pathways so that non-jurisdictional issues are directed to the right place without frustration. It can also assist in providing a warm handoff process so that Ombuds appropriate cases reach us quickly. This is essentially a proactive triage process in the community that avoids the runaround of being redirected by our own intake staff. When it comes to intake and investigations, I am fond of recognizing intake as the face of the organization. Every person who contacts our office, whether their complaint is investigated or not, is first treated by intake. Studies show that a person's determination of another person's trustworthiness is made within just the first moments of their initial meeting. No matter how effectively our communications may be, No matter how wonderful our outreach efforts are, it is the impression that the complainants take from intake that stays with them and determines if they will contact us again in future or recommend us to their acquaintances. Intake sets the tone for the relationship. Among the numerous steps taken by intake staff, they listen attentively, guide the conversation, outline the processes, and, no surprise, establish the expectations. For our office to be seen as credible, intake must reinforce the message previously given to the public. If the consistency of messaging from the general public to the complainants is going to be believed, it needs to be followed through to the rest of the functions of the organization. In order to maintain consistent messaging that is manifest in service delivery, everyone needs to be on the same page, singing the same tune, applying the same standards. This is assisted by a policy framework that includes written service standards and outlines progressive paths for review. This is good medicine that we regularly prescribe to those organizations subject to our oversight. Policy anchors fair processes. It must be thoughtfully developed, internally disseminated, well understood, consistently applied, and routinely updated. Whether we have a dedicated policy resource or a system for collecting and preserving precedent, the integrity of our investigations and the influence of our recommendations are founded on transparent, consistent processes. Setting them out clearly and accessibly is at its heart an effective, proactive practice. My last slide will outline how I manage expectations. Know them, read them, say them, write them, retell them, and rewrite them. At every opportunity, repeat and reinforce. Set it up front, say it again at those milestones. In my role as deputy, I have the responsibility of reviewing complaints about our services. Many of those complaints, by the time they have come to me, have been previously reviewed several times. In speaking with those complainants, whose tenacity I admire, by the way, I listen for clues to why they persist. Often I learn that what they expected, we could not provide. When it is a matter of unreasonable expectations on the part of the complainant, invariably they withdraw those complaints after they hear me hold to the same standards set by my office. Allow me to share one last piece of advice for proactive communication. There are times when the process of an investigation is set back for any number of legitimate reasons. It is at those times that I highly recommend taking the time to contact the complainant to advise them of the delay and cause of it as soon as possible. It is far too easy to skip this, thinking that it is only the outcome that interests the complainant and that a brief delay will be forgotten with a positive eventual conclusion. However, don't underestimate a complainant's reliance on you, clinging to an undertaking to meet specific milestones. You will win the respect of anyone who hears from you about the delay, without them having to wonder what has happened and having to call you instead for an explanation, which they will always suspect to be a made-up excuse. Ultimately, proactive communication is plain and predictable. The fewer surprises, the better outcomes. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions at the end of this panel discussion.
Thank you so much, David, for this insightful presentation, being straightforward and communicating adequately in a transparent manner always pays off in my mind. It is certainly something that should define our interventions. We do have to lead the way. We now shift our focus to technological side of things. Excuse me. Jean-Marc Nantais, the Canada Post Ombudsman, will speak on the promise of technology in the evolution of complaint handling. Jean-Marc has been Canada Post's Ombudsman since 2018. For the benefit of our international participants, Canada Post is a Crown corporation that functions as the primary postal operator in Canada. Jean-Marc has extensive knowledge in change management and customer service, and on a bonus note, He is not one to let us settle into easy patterns. He's a challenger of assumptions, a provocateur of ideas who invites us, if not out of the box, then certainly out of our comfort zones. Jean-Marc, we're happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. If you can move to the first slide. So I'm going to talk about technology, but more importantly, how we're trying to use artificial intelligence. So my hope is, some of our experience, some of our scars could be inspiring to you, especially in the area of artificial intelligence, AI. So I'm going to do my best. If you go to the next slide. So everybody understands who we are. We are tied to one organization. Many of you are supporting hundreds of organizations. In our case, it's just one. We have 10 employees. We do about 11 systemic recommendations a year. We receive about 4,000 appeals, but we do in-depth investigations on about 2,004. So it gives you a sense that we're a small to medium-sized ombudsman office. Next slide. So I'm going to be a little bit operational. I'm going to be a little bit tactical because I think I need to get you there so you see where we use artificial intelligence. So when a customer in Canada is not happy about the postal administration, they call customer service. So a customer has usually about 600 different reasons, 600 different types of complaints when they're not happy. We in the Ombudsman office only get about 100 of those. So out of 600 reasons to be upset about something, there's about 100 that usually end up with us. So we have to be really, really good at running about 100 different types of investigations. So 100 is really our space. On the next slide. So it's easy for us to interview customers to get their side of the story. It's easy to interview Canada Post to get their side of the story. The difficulty for us, it's all of the documentation about policies and procedures and all the stuff that regulates Canada Post. That's for us the biggest issue. If you go to the next slide, when you print all the policies and procedures that we need to factor in when we make an investigation and a decision, there's over 5,000 pages. And there's no one single human that can understand 5,000 pages. It's too difficult. So we've decided to use two different kind of tools to be able to get us at that complexity. Next slide. So the first tool we're using, we call this a knowledge tool. So basically, the first one is a knowledge tool. I'm going to walk you through it, but I'm going to walk you through it quickly because I want to get to technology. So knowledge tool, if you go to the next slide. So for every one of those 100 different types of investigations, we created a library. It's a library of about 500 documents. And it's for every single one of those issues that we tend to get as an appeal. We have the list of all the relevant policies. We have the list of all the questions our investigators must ask the customer. We have the list of all the questions that need to be asked of Canada Post. We have example of final decisions in like cases. We have a list of experts in the company we can pull as well. So we created this library of documents so that we never miss a beat. And that kind of guides what the investigation plan will be. Canada Post had to provide this, and this. Was it provided? Did Canada Post follow procedures and policies? So we created this library of documents for each of the 100 investigations, and it makes life easier when the investigators start the work. So that's kind of one. I'm not going to go into details. It's interesting, but I'm just going to move to technology. If you move to the next one, I think, perfect. So we've decided to look at AI, artificial intelligence. And for those of you who are not familiar, there's really two categories. There's multiple categories, but there are only two that are relevant. So the first one is called artificial general intelligence. So it's stuff like you can find on the web. It's like ChatGPT, it's like Gemini from Google, it's like Copilot from Microsoft. There's about 3 or 4 that are out there. They're free, they're generic. And usually what they do is they find, they summarize, they analyze. They don't make decisions, but they help you just go from big volume to smaller stuff. Very useful to us. And I'll show you how we use it. The second one, which is more difficult, it's called machine learning, and it's machine learning for business. So this is a whole series of AI tools, and there are hundreds of them. And you train the tool to make a business decision. So the general one don't make decisions, but the ones you train make decision. So years ago, we started to work with IBM Watson. We have trained IBM Watson, and now IBM Watson makes decision. The one we're working now is from Salesforce. It's called Einstein. We trained Einstein, and it makes decision. Now, the decisions always have to be reviewed by a human because I don't think the maturity is there, but it's completely different angle. One category summarizes, fetches, find, analyze. The other one is designed to make decisions. So I'm going to now walk you through how we use it. Next slide. So the first place we use it is with the intake team when they do triage and coding. The slide is a little bit busy, but if you follow me. So we're trying to not force, but direct as many customers as we can through the web. When they complain, as opposed to the phone, we make it real easy for them to complain through the web. They write their own story, they put the details they want, they attach what they want, and there's a lot of files of pictures and videos, so an online environment is very easy. So when people submit their complaint, their appeal online, it goes automatically to an AI engine that has been trained. So this is a machine learning AI engine. The AI reads the complaint, understands it, it can summarize it, and it can code it. So I imagine all of your intake functions code the cases that come in because you all have to report, and coding probably drives who it's going to be sent to. So this first AI tool reads, understands codes, and it could also summarize it. It's attached to our software tool that we use for case management, and the cost for us is 0 cent, $0. There is no cost to use it. If I go to the next one, the next slide, the other tool we use Copilot. Copilot is a general purpose AI tool that you find on the web. It's made by Microsoft. So what we do with Copilot is we give Copilot all of the policies and documents from Canada Post, all of them in a PDF file, and then we put it in, and we can interrogate the tool. Can you give me all the policies and procedures about when this happened? Can you give me policies and procedures that need to be followed when this happened? So not only does our knowledge tool have it, but by interrogating Copilot with all of the documents, policies from Canada Post, we're able to pull even more granular detail on policies and procedures. So we use Copilot to help us with taking a mountain of documents and distill in only what's relevant for the investigator for the investigation. The cost to us is 0 cent. It's free. If ever any of you are interested in looking at this, if you deal with organizations that have lots of documentations, you need to ask whether it's ChatGPT or Copilot or anyone else, Gemini, you need to ask to be locked. Locked means that whatever document you put in it will never be part of the larger memory of the tool. You don't want you don't want internal documents to ever be shared elsewhere or become part of the larger brain of the AI tool. So there's a concept called blocked, which means it will only be used with your department, your organization, and whatever you put in will never be shared. If you go to the next slide, the next slide is the next step we would like to go. This is where I would like to go. So my ideal state is I have another AI tool trained, so it's machine learning, and an appeal comes in. It's read by a tool. That appeal is now searched with all of the documents, so the policy documents. Second step is searched. All of the knowledge tools are being pulled, and it creates for every investigator a whole series of documents that are relevant. All of the knowledge tools, all of the analysis of the policies, it brings everything to the desktop of the investigator in literally less than a second for every investigation. We would never let an AI tool make a decision. I don't think it's at that level yet, but it definitely saves an incredible amount of time, provided the investigator checks the work. It's fabulous for us for getting stuff quickly and finding stuff that we would have never found manually in reviewing documents. So we have one on intake, we have one for policy search. This is where I'd like to go next. If you look at the next slide, which might be the last slide, next slide, right. So the other place we use it, and I'm assuming all of you are probably at that stage, but just in case, the generic AI tool, the ChatGPT, the Gemini, the Copilot, they're amazing if you just want to make a business decision. Forget ombudsman material. We are using it if you're a team leader. I'm a team leader. I have people under me. My director has people under her. For all the team leader, it's a fabulous tool. Like, for example, you can ask, my employee is struggling at the office, the quality is not there, the timing's not there. How should I approach the problem? The input you're going to take from the tool is quite impressive. I need to do a strategic plan. What should I include? What are the steps? You get great, valuable material as a leader. There's interpersonal conflict with people in my team. It's not working well. How, as a business leader, should I approach it? And the material you get is impressive. Someone in my office is continuing working late. They work on weekends. I don't know what's happening. As a team leader, how should I approach it? And you get really sharp, interesting details. So we also use AI as a day-to-day business leader, not just for ombudsman stuff. So I'm going to stop here. I just wanted to give you guys a bit of a sense of the various places we're exploring. We're touching AI at 2 or 3 places in 2 or 3 different ways. So I'm going to stop and be back for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marc. The use of AI is, in fact, is super present now in our daily work. It's our new reality, and therefore it's very relevant. Thank you for bringing your insight on the topic. I'm sure that colleagues with smaller offices, smaller team, or a sole ombudsman will have found much interest into this. Thank you very, very much, Jean-Marc. Our third panelist is Craig Thompson, the patient ombudsman for the province of Ontario. Excuse me. Craig has more than 40 years of leadership experience across the public and private sectors of healthcare, communications, and engineering. In his role, Craig is responsible for addressing complaints about experiences with Ontario's public hospitals, long-term care home, care services, and community surgical and diagnosis centers. Craig was vice president of FCO up until last June, and let me assure you that his engineer's mind, combined with his emotional intelligence, makes for a truly extraordinary combination. One that proved immensely valuable to our community and to the FCO president at the time. I'm talking about myself. We are pleased to welcome him today to discuss challenging complaint behavior and empowering teams. Dear Craig, welcome.
Thank you, Nadine. First of all, it's a pleasure to join you from Toronto on the same territorial lands as my colleague Paul Dubé. And it's also, it's a privilege to challenge in the service of fairness the status quo in pursuit of reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples here in Canada. So I'm really happy to be speaking to something that's very important to all of us in the ombuds world, the issues around complaints handling, and in particularly around challenging complaint behavior and empowering teams. And I wanted to approach this by looking at it through two lenses and telling you a little bit about what that means to our office and how our insights inform how we do that. But before I do that, I wanted to give some context for those of you who may not know what the Patient Ombudsman's Office is about. So we are the healthcare ombuds for Ontario, Canada. Ontario is Canada's most populous province. There's more than 16 million people, which represents 40% of the entire country's population. And it's the second largest province by area, over 1 million square kilometers, so a vast province. In Canada, healthcare is publicly funded, and in Ontario, it represents about 40% of the provincial budget. So we're talking about $91 billion spent annually on healthcare in Ontario. As Nadine said in the intro, we have oversight over hospitals, long-term care, home and community care, and surgical and diagnostic centers. So that represents many thousand organizations that deliver the healthcare in Ontario. We also receive about 5,000 complaints a year, and that's increased year over year in double digits, typically. And we've just completed 6 systemic investigations this year, and we're about 26 people strong. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor for where I'm coming from with the topics that I'm going to talk about. Next slide, please. So, and thinking about better practices, which is very much a concept that I'm familiar with coming from healthcare, which often people refer to best practices, but I like the idea of better practices because a practice really needs to be localized for the individual organization and setting that they're in. So we'll be talking I'll be talking about better practices around managing challenging complaint behavior. And there's 2 points I want to cover. The first one is around managing what we're now really speaking about, which is unreasonable conduct. And the second is the scenario of dealing with a complainant who's experiencing a mental health crisis. Now, maybe because we're a health ombuds, we may get more than our fair share of these situations where complainants are experiencing these sort of conduct. But I think there's lots for us to learn from what others have experienced just across the entire breadth of ombudsing. So when looking at managing unreasonable conduct, I think that's an important way to think about. It's not the complainant that we're speaking to. We're speaking to the actual conduct, the conduct of the individual. And it's not just complainants. I can also attest to certain organizations and people that we deal with at the organization side have similar behaviors. It's the unreasonable conduct that we're talking about. And I need to do a shout out here to the New South Wales ombudsperson because of the training that they have provided, not only in my organization, but many organizations here in Canada. And that training really is the foundation on which we've been able to evolve our practices around dealing with unreasonable conduct. And there's a couple of points that I just want to touch on that really comes from that training with New South Wales. The first being how important it is to define and recognize what is unreasonable conduct. Being able to name it is really important because that really is the trigger that allows you to recognize that you are now into a different situation where you're having to respond to behaviors that require us to adjust our process in order to hopefully continue with the resolution process or an investigation and not be sidetracked by the unreasonable conduct. So being able to do that is very important, and that's an important aspect of the training that we provide our entire organization around defining what is unreasonable conduct. But where that starts is developing those frameworks and the strategies about how you respond to them. So that's important in many ways. One of them being that when someone comes to our office, we want to have a consistency of response. So our service needs to be consistent with everyone that comes to us in terms of how we approach, particularly dealing with unreasonable conduct. And by developing those frameworks and those strategies based on the training that we get from organizations like New South Wales, but then localizing it to our lived experience here in Ontario, really is important so that we make it our own and we respond in a way that is genuine to how this office functions. And so those frameworks allow us to then activate the strategies that allow us to be able to hopefully move forward with that complainant. And that can be in many different manifestations, where it can be even from the standpoint of how we ask questions and how we would take people through our process, and where we would look for ways to modify or de-escalate. Those are all the aspects of creating frameworks and strategies so that you have a toolkit. It's also really important to have those in place in an organization like ours for when we bring new individuals into the organization from a training standpoint, because everyone, I feel, from my role all the way through to all the different departments that we've got, needs to be able to understand what we mean by unreasonable conduct. It's a social contract that we have with each other, that there will be certain behaviors that we will not tolerate for all the right reasons, and we all want to be able to respond in an appropriate way. And we do that because for the reasons of protecting fairness, safety, and the resource equity while maintaining access. So protecting fairness is fundamental. We are an ombuds. We are in the business of fairness. We want to make sure that when people come to our office, they're treated fairly and they feel that they're being treated fairly, even if they are displaying unreasonable conduct. Even in those situations, we want to make sure that they feel that they are still being treated in a fair way. Safety is essential. Safety for our staff, safety for the complainant. We want to make sure that people's individual circumstances are recognized so that we can, ideally provide the service that's appropriate. But recognizing that when we are dealing with complaints involving unreasonable conduct, it does take more energy. It takes a lot of fortitude to be able to continue to work through those complaints. And so we want to make sure that people are safe. And then from an equity standpoint and maintaining access, we never want to shut a door. Even when someone is displaying unreasonable conduct, we look to use our strategies so that we can create an opportunity to continue the conversation at another time, or when someone is in a better position to be able to deal with to work with us. So that maintaining of access from an equity standpoint is really important. And so those are the 3 points that when I think about what we're doing to manage unreasonable conduct are really important. When it comes to the scenario where a complainant is experiencing a mental health crisis, then we also want to make sure that we deal with this in a way that is consistent across the board in the office. And I'm going to speak to a couple points that allows us to do that. It's really important in these scenarios to prioritize safety, recognizing that when someone is experiencing a mental health crisis, that could be somebody is in impending peril, and we need to be able to recognize that quickly. And the well-being of that individual requires that we immediately assess the risk and recognize it as quickly as we can so that we can provide the service that's appropriate for that individual. The immediate risk recognition piece is really important because it allows us to know that our process of resolution, or whether it's in an interview for an investigation, has stopped for all intents and purposes. And we're now in a different process to find the appropriate supports for that individual. So that immediate recognition piece is very important. I can speak to an experience we most recently had in our office with training with a local distress center, that through doing role playing, we were able to really hone that ability for us to recognize the triggers, the statements that people may say that allow us to realize that we are no longer on a regular trajectory for this complaint, that we are in a different kind of trajectory towards trying to find this person a safe referral or a safe some way to maintain their safety. So that's really an important piece that we continue to work on, but really feel that the role playing was very helpful in us doing that. The second point I want to make is around, communicating with empathy and compassion. It's really part and parcel with the work that we do in our office, but even more so when we're dealing with a complainant that may be experiencing a mental health crisis. So in those circumstances, clarity of what we're saying is essential, so that we can adapt to the person's needs. We have we have clear ideas about how we would like a complaint to move through our process, but when we're dealing with somebody in crisis, those rules don't go quite out the window, but we need to adjust. And so by listening through active listening techniques to what a person's needs are, we can adapt. And that could mean that we're giving them opportunities to maybe check in with us at a later time when they're in a better place. Maybe after they've been able to be supported by another support organization who's better positioned than we are to help them with their mental health needs. But making sure that we maintain that door always open, never shutting that door, and making sure that we accommodate an individual's personal needs. And then finally, always balancing the fairness, the rights to complain, and our own organizational boundaries and limitations. We know that we are in the service business. We always want to do right by the people that come to our office. They come to us with very challenging scenarios in healthcare. And so we want to make sure we're actively listening to what they're telling us, because those stories, as Sir Rob said at the top, are so important that we get it right, because that's how we do the work of ombudsing. But balancing that with the fact that in this moment, when dealing with someone experiencing a mental health crisis, we need to understand the limitations that we have as ombuds, as an organization, and know that at some point our process may stop, and we are now doing our best to hand off, we call it a warm handoff, to another organization that might be able to help somebody through a mental health crisis is actually a good outcome, because again, it allows someone to get to a place where they can get the care they need, but again, recognizing that our office will always be available, that they can return to when they're feeling more well or more in a position to be able to help us to move through a resolution process or an investigation. So that's some of the thoughts that I wanted to explain in terms of the lens that our office comes at when looking at better practices around complaints handling. If I could have the next slide, please. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I've called emergent practices or approaches, or maybe where there's the areas where our office is spending time and energy in trying to evolve our office to adopt approaches that really speak to the changes in how we are delivering service in ombudsing, and also mirrors some of what we see in the sector that we have oversight. So healthcare very much informs how we approach the work of ombudsing, because we know that the stakeholders that we deal with, that is their comfort zone. And so we want to be able to honor that and learn from it as well. So we bring our ombuds hat, but then we also are sponges when it comes to what works in the healthcare sectors that we have oversight. So the 2 points that I want to talk about are trauma-informed service and quality improvement science. The first one, trauma-informed service, I hope is not a new concept. It's something that in healthcare I came to be introduced over 10 years ago in trauma-informed care, particularly in the sector of mental health and addictions. And trauma-informed care has evolved to, I think, include any organization that is in service, where it's a recognition that people are coming to our offices in a state of heightened anxiety and also with trauma that they've experienced, maybe as a result of the issue that they're bringing to our office, maybe because of just their lived experience. But the trauma that they've experienced previously will inform the experience that they'll have with us. So trauma-informed service is really trying to get to a higher level of service so that we can really do the best work that we can and get to the best kinds of resolutions and investigations. The 3 points I want to talk about here are, the first one being prioritizing cultural safety, trust and transparency. So I can't emphasize enough how cultural safety is imperative in the work that we're doing, particularly when it comes to working with Indigenous complainants. Cultural safety means that people, when they come to our office, see something that's familiar, and it's not something that may have the impact of putting up more barriers that they've already experienced. And Ombudsman is a construct of colonial times, and so when dealing with complainants from Indigenous communities, we recognize that. And so we want to make sure that we have opportunities to provide that culturally safe and appropriate service, because that's going to allow us to build the trust with the complainants and their communities, because without the trust, it's really hard to do the work that we have to do. And the trust works both ways. It's not only trust with the complainant, but it's trust with the healthcare organizations that we work with, and many of them are Indigenous-led healthcare organizations. And then around transparency, always wanting to make sure that we're being clear about what we can and cannot do, and being transparent about our limitations and transparent about processes. The second point is around maximizing the complainant's voice, choice, and collaboration. So the idea of active listening means that we've got to give, results in us giving voice to people that come to us to tell their stories. And by maximizing that complainant's voice, we achieve many things that are required for us to have a productive and constructive relationship. And that also means that in listening to that complainant's voice, we're recognizing that there may be an opportunity here to give choice, because one size does not fit all, and this is where we might be able to build some trust by being flexible in how we approach a process or approach something that we're doing to achieve a resolution. And that always is the best, to find choice through collaboration. We know so little about people's own lived experiences that come to us, so we have to be always listening for those opportunities where we can learn from them and collaborate on adjusting our processes and approaches so that it meets people in a place that allows their voice to be clear. And then always wanting to avoid re-traumatization by adjusting those processes and an environment. We certainly need to have our standards of service. We certainly need to know and have pathways for how we want to get to a resolution or to undertake an investigation, but we need to be flexible and adjust accordingly. One, it's going to make for a better process ultimately, but two, we want to avoid re-traumatizing a complainant. So that means that we give choice for things like, particularly for an investigation we just finished, where in choosing who was going to be the interviewee, what was the environment that interview would take place, who was going to be attending, and so forth. So these are small ways that we can adjust our process while staying true to the format and still achieve the ends. And then the second part is quality improvement science. And this one, maybe it's because I'm an engineer by training, is something I embrace, and it's very much embraced in healthcare. The science and discipline of quality improvement is really essential, I think, also because we want to empower our teams, we want to empower ourselves to be able to learn from what we hear from complainants, to make use of data, to make use of technology, but to always be in a mode of quality improvement and that virtuous cycle of looking for ways to do better. And we do that by adopting systemic measurement, analysis, discovery, and learning. So for us, the active listening is the first part. The second part is making sure that we can get that information into our complaints management systems in a way that is systematic, and consistent so that we can measure it, so we can analyze it and report on it. It's so important that we get that right, because it really allows us to be able to leverage that information. We also need to be curious to discover new things about the way we do this work and what we're hearing from complainants, and learning always. Integrating complaint handling into the overall organizational quality framework is really important as well. So as an organization, we have quality goals. It's not just the service at the front line that we worry about. We think about the quality of every aspect of our organization. But we don't just think about complaint handling on its own. It's really part of the broader picture of what quality means in our office. So we want to make sure it's integrated, and that everybody has a seat at the table when it comes to advancing quality at an overall organizational level. And finally, being responsive, encouraging iterative change, and establishing the virtuous feedback loop. It's so important, again, for us to be responsive, timely. I'm a big proponent of timeliness. I think it's really the underpinnings of fairness, that we're responsive and timely. We want to always encourage in our teams iterative change. Nothing is set in stone. No one size fits all. So we need to be able to move that needle constantly, all the while bringing people along with us as we make those changes. And finally, establishing that virtuous feedback loop is essentially what's good for the goose is also good for us. So if we want to learn, if we want organizations to learn from the complaints that they hear, we need to learn from the complaints that people may have about our organization. So creating that virtuous feedback loop is really essential, and we are in the first stages of doing that, and hope to reap many benefits from that. So that's very quickly some of the approaches and best practices that I wanted to highlight that our office is adopting and embracing. And I look forward to listening to more of the sessions.
Thank you, Craig. I like the social contract that you referred to earlier in the presentation. It can sometimes be difficult to stick to your plan when managing challenging complainant behavior while ensuring staff feel confident in their roles. You explained it well, and it transpires caring. So we're a little bit behind in our schedule, so I'm turning immediately to our last topic on this panel, which is measuring efficiency, why, what, and how. Kwame Addo, the Ombudsman of the City of Toronto, Canada's largest city, will be leading us through this presentation. Kwame is passionate about advancing equity and fairness, breaking down barriers, and amplifying voices of people from underserved groups. Kwame brings not only wisdom and experience, but also a spirit of integrity and compassion that continues to inspire our field. Kwame, welcome. The microphone is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Nadine, and thank you, Paul, for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Perhaps we can move to the next slide, please. Next one as well. So while preparing for my presentation this afternoon, I found several insightful quotes from some unlikely sources. A humorist and a cartoonist, a writer, poet, and one of the most renowned scientists in history. Individuals you wouldn't associate with ombudsman work, but their words resonated with me because of their relevance to our topic today, particularly the comment from Albert Einstein, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And I think this quote really encapsulates the unique challenges that ombudsman offices face. Fairness is not easily measurable. But does that mean that we should just throw up our hands in the air and groan? No, what it does mean, though, is that we need to be thoughtful about what we measure. When we're talking about evaluating our effectiveness, we need to ask ourselves, are we focusing on the right things as opposed to the easier things to measure? Because in the end, those are the measures that define the real value of our work. Next slide, please. And here's something else. In their article, Organizational Ombuds Program, a good governance and trust strategy, Williams and Redmond argue that methods for measuring the effectiveness of an ombudsman's office do not exist. Unlike a service delivery organization, an ombudsman doesn't produce widgets or process transactions. Our work is about fairness, trust, and systemic improvement, things that are not easily counted. A single investigation can have far-reaching impact, while 10 early resolution cases may not. This is why we can't rely solely on traditional metrics, but we also can't ignore them. We need to find a balance. And so over the next few slides, I'll explore both sides of that debate, arguments for and against performance measurements, and share how we at Ombudsman Toronto approach this balance. Next slide, please. So I want to be clear, I'm not against performance measures per se. Accountability is essential in our work. Like any organization, my office must be held to high standards. We need to ensure timely case resolutions, echoing what Craig just mentioned. We need to hold staff accountable, measure the impact of our public education activities, and much more. But here's the real challenge. How do we measure these elements in a way that truly reflects our value and effectiveness as an organization? And so this reminds me of a recurring conversation that I used to have with my former boss, Fiona Crean, the inaugural ombudsman for the city. So every year before we released our annual report, she grew really anxious about potential criticism about our complaint numbers. And so let me remind you, these conversations were taking place during the early days of the organization when we were focused on completing foundational tasks. So, raising awareness of the organization through public education, hiring staff, conducting investigations, all occurring at the same time. And to be honest, our complaint numbers back then were nowhere close to where they are today. But my response to her was always the same. I told her that while numbers matter, they don't always tell the full story. And instead of fixating solely on our complaint statistics, we needed to emphasize the real impact of our work, the story behind those numbers. So take our work with seniors, for example. Thanks to our investigation and recommendations, elderly tenants were saved from eviction due to unpaid arrears. We also changed how division treated residents and the city as a whole with dementia and cognitive impairments. Or our investigation into the oversight of TTC fare inspectors. Our recommendations aimed at addressing and reducing racial profiling by transit enforcement staff help make the public transportation system safer for everyone. And through our work at the city's approach to encampment clearings, we helped ensure that the needs and safety of encampment residents were prioritized when future clearings were contemplated. These stories illustrate the change behind the numbers, real people benefiting from our efforts. Next slide. So traditionally, ombudsman offices have equated higher complaint numbers with greater effectiveness or strong public awareness. After all, people are unlikely to reach out for, oops, go back, please. Go back. Yeah, thank you. People are unlikely to reach out for assistance if they don't believe we can help them. But numbers don't always tell the full story. It is not uncommon for our office to experience a sharp rise in complaints related to a specific issue that generates a significant publicity. We also see an increase in complaint numbers when we release an investigation report. But what happens in the subsequent year when the issue fades from public attention and the number of complaints declines? Does this drop mean that our office is less effective? Does it indicate that the public is less aware of our work? Or could it suggest something entirely different, like the fact that we successfully resolved a large systemic issue the previous year and the number of complaints about it has gone down as a result? If we only look at the numbers, we risk missing the big picture. Instead of viewing a decrease in complaints as a failure, we should see it as a potential evidence of success, a sign that our earlier work may have had a lasting effect. Our previous efforts may have eliminated or significantly reduced a recurring problem that once dominated our caseloads because we were able to apply a systemic fix to the problem. Our numbers are a tool, not the entire story. They help to identify potential inefficiencies and address them. Data can help us identify emerging trends and potential areas for investigation. It can highlight communities we need to reach, and it can guide our priorities, pointing us towards areas where our involvement can have a significant impact. Something else to keep in mind: we have limited control over who contacts the office or the kinds of issues they bring. To some extent, our work is shaped by those who choose to come forward. That's why numbers alone cannot define our effectiveness. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates some of the typical measures that ombudsmen and similar oversight bodies tend to use. These kind of metrics help us to monitor activity and efficiency. Timeliness, I'd just like to talk on timeliness for a second. To my mind, timeliness is critical to our work. It's important to have early resolution and investigations resolved in a timely fashion. I think that the biggest fear that an ombuds office could have, or my biggest fear, is to have a backlog of complaints that wouldn't be appropriate in my view. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this slide and the ones that, oh, go back, please. Go back. Can you just go back? Thank you. So this slide and the ones that follow highlight several of the metrics we track to help better understand how we serve the public and identify areas for improvement. On the previous slide, I touched on timeliness. So we aim to complete our work promptly while ensuring that efficiency does not come at the expense of quality. Like much of the working world, our office had to quickly transition from in-person to remote work during the pandemic. But to our surprise, once we adapted to this new model, staff efficiency actually increased. In 2021, just over 92% of our cases were resolved within 30 days. And as you can see on the slide, the number has decreased slightly last year to 89%, but it still remains higher than the rates we experienced in 2020 and 2019. I've also highlighted the number of consultations we engaged in with the city over the years. Last year, we held 26 formal consultations, up from 20 the previous year and 18 in 2022. And these consultations allow public servants to seek our input on new programs or policies from an ombudsman's perspective, focusing on fairness and equity, and identify potential problems prior to their implementation. While this has always been part of our approach, we've really become more proactive in raising awareness of this aspect of our work among city divisions. For example, we provided feedback through our consultation with the Toronto Seniors Housing Corporation on the development of their new tenant human rights policy and complaints procedure. We also offered input on the Toronto Transit Commission's draft anti-racism policy. The public service has come to recognize these proactive consultations as a key strength of the Ombudsman's Office. Next slide. Next slide, please. Our case management system generates a weekly data report that provides a, oh, go back, please. Back. Could you just go back one slide, please? Thank you. Our case management system generates a weekly data report that provides a comprehensive report of the office's caseload. At a glance, we can see the number of cases received, cases closed, their age, and the types of cases we're handling. Next slide. This information is available on a dashboard for our team leads, the Deputy Ombudsman and myself, giving us real-time insights into the status of each file, whether it's at intake, awaiting assessment, or awaiting approval for closure. Next slide. By monitoring these numbers, we can identify bottlenecks and ensure that files are moving efficiently. Week-over-week comparisons allow us to spot trends by division or issue and stay proactive in managing our caseload. However, we don't rely solely on statistics. We hold regular one-on-one meetings with staff to make sure cases are progressing. When needed, we develop action plans, which may include transferring files or temporarily pausing new assignments to prioritize older or high priority cases. Next slide. Since becoming the Ombudsman, one of my priorities has been to make sure that everyone who needs our services knows about them and can access them. Historically, most complaints come from the old city of Toronto, fewer complaints from the former boroughs of Scarborough, Etobicoke, York, and North York. Complaints from Black and Indigenous communities have also been underrepresented, and many low-income neighborhoods lie outside the downtown core. So to address this, we've targeted our engagement toward equity-deserving and vulnerable groups. We've also set location-specific targets to ensure more even outreach across the city. And this is a great example of how we use our data to guide our decisions. By analyzing where complaints originate and which communities are underrepresented, we can focus our efforts strategically, making sure staff time and energy are directed where they can have the biggest impact. Next slide. So timeliness in our larger investigations remains a priority, and we are actively exploring ways to prevent our larger investigations from extending beyond a year. One factor we've identified is the influx of new investigators that have come aboard over the last 2 years. Some of these investigators may not have had experience leading large systemic reviews, which can result in overcomplicating tasks, turning over 10 stones when 6 may have sufficed. We're also focusing on providing better support with report writing as we require investigators to draft their final reports. Following the conclusion of systemic review, we've begun to hold debrief sessions to discuss what went well, what didn't go as well as expected, and apply that learning to future investigations so that we aren't repeating the same mistakes or running into the same issues. We don't have a set maximum caseload for investigators or intake staff. Their numbers can fluctuate based on the complexity of their caseload, the nature of their work, or our own general workload. Next slide. Slide. So up until this point, I've talked a lot about efficiency through numbers. We've heard you mention complaint volumes, timeliness, geographic location of complaints. And all this information helps us understand what we're doing and how much of it we're doing. But numbers can only take us so far. The real question is, what difference are we actually making? Impact in the context of ombudsman work isn't solely about the number of files we close or the number of engagement activities we perform. It's about the change for individuals, change for institutions, and ultimately change for the public good. Sometimes that impact is tangible. Maybe a city division changes its policy after one of our investigations. Maybe a vulnerable tenant finally receives the service that they were entitled to. Those are real, measurable results. But often impact is less visible and yet just as powerful. It can show up in the way public servants think differently about fairness. For example, prioritizing the needs of encampment residents when planning a clearing. It's reflected in the tone of communication between a resident and a public servant. It's that quiet shift towards a more transparent, accountable culture. Those outcomes don't neatly fit into a spreadsheet, but they're the ones that truly matter. Impact is difficult to measure. You can count complaints, but how do you count trust? You can record policy changes, but how do you quantify a sense of fairness? Many of the most meaningful outcomes of our work unfold gradually, sometimes over years. One example that comes to mind is the city's introduction of the administrative monetary penalty system to dispute parking tickets. We recommended that the city adopt that approach in 2012, but it didn't come into effect until 2017. That's why when we talk about assessing impact, we need to take a blended approach. Yes, we need to continue to track the numbers, but we also need to gather qualitative evidence, stories, case studies, testimonials, and feedback from the people and the agencies that we serve. Together, these perspectives create a richer, more authentic picture of what success looked like. So as we think about efficiency, let's remember efficiency is about doing things right, but impact is about doing the right things. And I think that's where Ombudsman's real value lies, not only in resolving individual cases, but in helping improve systems and build trust with the people they serve. So when we ask, what's the impact of our work? We're really asking, how have we made things more fair, more accessible, and more accountable for the public? That's the ultimate measure of success. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Kwame. Really interesting food for thought about the stories beyond the numbers and how ombuds offices can measure impact instead of just showing up statistics. Very, very interesting, and it certainly will be useful. I'm talking for myself. That concludes our first panel. Thank you to all speakers for sharing their valuable expertise with us today. We now invite our four speakers back on the screen to engage in some questions and discussion. A reminder to our participants that you can submit questions using the Q&A function. Excuse me. I don't see any questions yet. Is this a technical problem, or is it that there are no questions yet?
No questions quite yet. We're certainly hoping some people will take a minute or two, type some in, and we'll let you know when they come through.
So Kwame, Jean-Marc, David, and Craig, how do we balance efficiency, empathy, and technology to ensure complaint handling remains both fair and human? Whoever want to start?
Well, maybe I'll start. And when you say it that way, the job is never going to be done. I think that's the first thing that I take away, is that there's so many balls that you have to keep in the air to be able to achieve those goals, and you'll be successful in some and not in others, but you're constantly driving forward with them. So while you want efficiency and you want to be able to be good at handling complaints, you don't want to do that at the expense of compassion and spending the time that we need to do the listening. That's so important. And at the same time, you want to be able to leverage technology without it becoming, a draw on resources and being its own rabbit hole that you can go down. So I think it's just a constant, we're constantly just sort of balancing those different priorities. But if we stick to our goals, the fundamentals of what it means to be fair, that's really our guiding light, I think, in terms of complaints handling and doing it the best way we can. But I think ultimately telling stories is probably the thing that cuts through and really speaks to impact the most.
Yes, Kwame.
I think that the human interaction is really the biggest tool that we have. I can't tell you how many times somebody has told me or told one of a staff person that, your staff or your office was the first organization that really took the time to sit down and listen to my story, allow me to put my views forward. I may not agree with your decision at the end of the day, but I feel that the process has been valuable and I feel heard. And at the end of the day, I think that's what people want, is an opportunity to be heard and to be treated fairly. And that's always going to be at the forefront of what we do. These tools that Jean-Marc and others spoke of will obviously help us do that, hopefully in a way that is efficient. But I think that human piece or that human touch will always be at the forefront of what we do as ombuds.
David.
Thank you. I agree with both of those statements. Whenever I think about compassion and empathy and the personal element, the human touch of our work, I also have to think about the people who do it, and I think about compassion fatigue and just how difficult it is to do this job. In balancing that, it's important as if there's some way to be able to quantify the value and the joy and the gratification that comes from doing this job, solving a problem for someone, or hearing that feedback that says, thank you very much, you're the first that has done something for me and allowed me to be treated well. That's the balance that I find is tough to achieve. And I think we always have to keep our staff members first and foremost in this, because just like they tell you on the airplane, you can't help somebody put on an oxygen mask if you're not wearing one yourself first. So we need to, I would highly encourage not neglecting the people that do this work. Not that we do, we value them highly, and I highly encourage that.
Thank you, David. Yes, Jean-Marc?
Even if I was brought in to talk technology, the human element, key one, we have found that the best value we could provide as an office is, there's two. One, of course, is individual appeals, making a recommendation on individual cases. We've also found that developing systemic recommendations also had a huge impact from a future perspective and preventing recurring issues from happening. And I know not all ombudsman offices are equipped or staffed to do systemic recommendation, but operating on those two fronts, which are both, about making life better for whoever is on the receiving end, made a huge difference. What we have found, though, and I bet it's the same thing in the 30 countries listening to us today, we found that the people we deal with are increasingly more impatient. There's more pressure. There's pressure on rent. There's pressure on expenses. There's pressure on savings. There's pressure on people come from all over the place, and we find that there's people trigger easier, they trigger faster, there's more impatience, people are more upset than they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There's something about the environment where the people we talk to and we find that the human element in a space like this is even more important.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. We do have now many questions in the Q&R section. I'm going to go with a question for you, Jean-Marc. Thank you. It was very interesting. Would you mind elaborating on the training you spoke of about machine learning AI?
Yeah. The entire media space today, if you're interested in AI, it's about those generic tools. Anyone can access to the web. The entire media space is around those. That's not where the money is. That's not where the revenue is. This is not where AI is going to make money. Where the AI, all the development is on machine learning. So developing an AI for nurses, developing an AI for doctors, developing an AI for people who do real estate management, developing an AI for people who do chemistry. So it's all of those function-specific, industry-specific. That's where all the money, the investment is. My wife is a trainer for AI. So she's hired by Gemini, she's hired by Copilot, she's hired by all of them, and she trains those AI, and they have to be trained. So usually for us, we work with IBM Watson. IBM Watson says, give us at least 1,000 decisions you've made, ideally 10,000. But if you give us 1,000 decisions you've made on something specific, feed us, and the AI will learn how you make a decision, what you factor in, and it will make the decision for you. We will never rely on AI to make a decision. It always is positioned as an aid to the investigator. I don't think AI is there yet. But there is an industry of AI tools that are available to be trained. Every organization we dealt with says, give us 1,000 decisions, whether it's an intake decision, whether it's an investigator decision, whatever type of decision you make, if you feed the engine with 1,000 decisions minimally, it will learn in about 24 hours, and it will be able to make your decision. So that's what we've decided to deal with and test it and try it on top of using the generic AI tools.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. And I now know that you have a secret weapon at home, so now I understand a little bit more. We're going to go with one last question for you, Kwame. Please, do you conduct, and I'm passing on all the congratulations and the thank yous. Of course, you know that people really appreciated all your four presentations. So, Kwame, do you conduct customer satisfaction surveys as part of your assessment of impact? If so, how do you gather the data?
No, the short answer is no, we haven't gone down that road as of yet. But one of the things that we have done is to commemorate the 5th anniversary of the office opening or establishing. We did engage what used to be Ryerson University, it's called Toronto Metropolitan University, to conduct an evaluation of the effectiveness of the Ombudsman Office. And if anybody's interested, that study is on our website. And they spoke to various levels of the public service, senior managers, mid-level managers, frontline staff, and asked them questions about the role of the office, the effectiveness of our office, good and bad, about what they felt. And a lot of that feedback was very informative and helped to refine some of our practices. And we developed a evaluation toolkit that came out of that we shared with the IOI a number of years ago to allow other organizations who might want to go down that road to utilize that tool to evaluate their own offices.
Thank you. Jean-Marc?
Nadine, yeah, we have tried surveys. So if anybody's interested, for several years here in the Ombudsman office, at the end of an investigation, when we were giving the final recommendation, the final decision, there was a little link to a survey. We've discovered that every time our decision is in favor of the customer, the reviews were amazing. And when it was not in favor of the customer, the reviews were awful. So we felt there was a clear bias about all the results every time. So we decided to trash it. What we do now, at the end of every investigation, when we close the case, usually by email, we send people a survey, but it's really one question. It's an open question that, is there anything we believe the office should do to improve? Is there anything else? And with the verbatim, which is an open question, we find tons of good little ideas, but it's a one question survey. And don't rate us. We don't want to be rated. If you have ideas on how we could do things better. So with that one single question, we found value. But with a structured questionnaire, we had found no value. So we killed it.
Super interesting. Thank you, Jean-Marc. So I thank you very, very much, Jean-Marc, David, Craig, Kwame. Thank you for your very, very interesting input. And we will now go to our 10-minute break, and we will return at 2:55. So see you in a bit. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed a little break. We're excited to introduce to you our second panel for the day, Democracy and the Role of the Ombudsman. Through the next 4 speakers, we'll touch on topics such as protecting rights, responding to threats, international standards, and finally, collaboration. Excuse me. First up on the panel is Jay Shock, Ombudsperson for the province of British Columbia. Jay has been ombudsperson since May 2015, where he's led several wide-reaching systemic investigations and led the development of a proactive fairness consultation and training service for public authorities. For over a decade, Jay has been a driving force for fairness and accountability, shaping public oversight in ways that will resonate for years to come. Please welcome Jay here to discuss protecting rights as well as services.
Good morning from beautiful British Columbia, and I guess that's good afternoon in Ontario, and good evening in other parts of the world. I just wanted to start by wishing the Ombudsman of Ontario a happy 50th birthday, and thank Paul for including me on this panel. I'm an alumnus from the Ontario Ombudsman. I worked there when it celebrated its 9th birthday, so it's pretty daunting and kind of making me feel a little elderly to be joining today's celebration. Before I begin, I would just want to acknowledge with respect that I'm joining, as did David, from the same territory, that of the Lekwungen people, the Esquimalt-Songhees First Nations, and that the work of our office extends across the province of British Columbia and the many homelands of Indigenous people. And in making that acknowledgement, I just want to reaffirm my commitment and that of my office to doing what we can to ensure that Indigenous people are treated fairly by the public authorities that we superintend. So today I'll be discussing how we as ombuds institutions can work to uphold not just services, but also rights. And then I'll be giving you a few quick examples of work that's happened in the past. Next slide, please. So this won't be new for most of the group, but recognizing that we have global participation at this conference, I'll give you a little bit of background to us. In British Columbia, the Ombudsperson Act lets us investigate a decision, an action, a delay, or a process that may have treated somebody unfairly. And if we find unfairness, the Act lets us explain why and recommend practical and principled fixes, a change in policy, providing reasons, tightening timelines, suggesting legislation. We don't replace courts. We diagnose administrative unfairness, including whether a public body acted contrary to law. That's one of the types of maladministration that the Ombudsperson Act empowers us to identify. And then we identify those solutions through evidence and persuasion and follow-up. So the Supreme Court of Canada confirmed in a case called BCDC and Friedman the remedial nature of the Ombudsman Act, as it was then named. On behalf of the court, Justice Dixon described the implications of this this way. Read as a whole, the Ombudsman Act of British Columbia provides an efficient procedure through which complaints may be investigated, bureaucratic errors and abuses brought to light, and corrective action initiated. It represents the paradigm of remedial legislation. It should therefore receive a broad purposive interpretation consistent with the unique role the Ombudsman is intended to fulfill. This unique role includes characteristics such as our impartial, easily accessed, and freely available services, our often informal investigative processes, and our broad powers of investigation that, as Justice Dixon said, quote, can bring to light cases of bureaucratic maladministration that would otherwise pass unnoticed, close quote. The powers in the Ombudsperson Act allow us, as Justice Dixon said, quote, to address administrative problems that the courts, the legislature, and the executive cannot effectively resolve. So our application of the various types of maladministration in the Act should be consistent with what the Supreme Court of Canada has laid out, that broad purposive interpretive approach. Now, much, indeed most of the work of a maladministration ombuds will be about the fair administration of services, but a significant minority of the investigations we do engage issues of rights. Next slide, please. So by ensuring fair services, we often are simultaneously protecting people's rights. They're not mutually exclusive, they often intersect. But to view an ombud only as being concerned with service adequacy is to read down the mandate in a way that I don't think Friedman intended. We start with administrative fairness, and where it intersects, we sharpen with a rights lens. There are many sources to ground an ombuds in a rights paradigm. First of all, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Administrative decisions must respect charter rights and values, liberty, equality, dignity, autonomy. A failure to align with charter values can support an unfairness finding. For example, Section 7 of the Charter sets out fundamental rights of life, liberty, and security of the person, including the right not to be deprived of those rights except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. What could be more in the Ombuds wheelhouse? Secondly, international law instruments. There's a rich inventory of international legal instruments. And while courts in Canada do not enforce these instruments except where they've been incorporated into domestic law, ombuds are not so constrained. We can use them as best practice standards for governments to assess, or we can assess government conduct in light of those best practice standards. In some recent reports, we have cited all of the following: the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, the UN Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, also known as the Mandela Rules, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Paul, in his remarks, will be expanding on the use of these international standards. Thirdly, Indigenous rights and reconciliation. We interpret statutes consistently with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which has been incorporated into BC domestic law by the Declaration Act. And we apply a distinctions-based approach when we do that. So we bring these lenses where they can add clarity or improve a fix. It doesn't replace the types of maladministration in the Ombudsperson Act. Rather, it sharpens our understanding of administrative fairness. Next slide, please. So some examples. So first I want to mention a report on the left of the slide, Committed to Change. So this was a 2019 systemic investigation that we conducted into how hospitals and health authorities were or were not complying with the Mental Health Act in terms of admission of involuntary psychiatric patients. There are 6 steps set out in the Act to protect the civil rights of people who are admitted involuntarily to a mental health facility. And we found widespread failures to complete these steps. Indeed, we found that in only 28% of the time were all those steps met. And we issued 24 recommendations accepted by government and the health authorities. So what's the connection to rights? Well, because involuntary admission limits core liberties, the ability of someone to be free in society, the Act requires lawful documentation, consent, treatment records, and rights information. And our report showed that those safeguards were not being carried out in practice. No rights advice forms existed for over half the patients, for example. It undermined people's ability to understand or challenge their detention or to get help. And as a result of our report, the legislature has passed legislation establishing a scheme of rights advisors for involuntary psychiatric patients. The next report is one from Ontario, called Mia's Story, an Ombudsman Ontario investigation into the York Region's Children's Aid Society handling of a 16-year-old's finding that the agency failed to provide the foster placement and support she repeatedly requested, and that the agency misunderstood how to use voluntary youth services agreements. The report made 20 recommendations, all accepted by the Children's Aid Society in question, and the province also committed to improving knowledge across the sector. The connection to rights, well, the Ombudsman found Mia's right to be heard and to participate in decisions affecting her wasn't respected. Staff prioritized an admission prevention approach and suggested shelter instead of considering her specific requests and best interests. These failures undermined her access to protection and appropriate care that child welfare law is meant to secure. The next report is one 2021 report from our office called Alone. And it was our systemic investigation into the use of separate confinement or segregation at British Columbia's main youth custody center. And it found that prolonged and repeated isolation or in separate confinement, including instances lasting weeks, unsafe practices, disproportionate impact on Indigenous and racialized girls, and we made 26 recommendations, including a hard cap in separate confinement of 22 hours, and independent review or oversight of any placement. The connection to rights, well, the report ties youth custody isolation practices to core rights protections, Canadian and international standards, the Federal Youth Criminal Justice Act, and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, to require humane, dignity-respecting treatment and limit isolation. However, we found that BC's practices and discretion under the youth custody regulation allowed prolonged confinement that risked breaching those protections. And our report calls for law and oversight changes so decisions align with those rights in practice. So those three prior examples are expression of positive rights. But as we have seen, at least since the Supreme Court of Canada's 1959 decision in Roncarelli and Duplessis, rights can also be negative rights, a restraint on government action. Negative rights can also be used in the ombuds world. And an example of this is the report on the far right of your screen, our 2020 report called Extraordinary Times, Extraordinary Measures. So what it was an investigation that we conducted reviewing 2 COVID-19 ministerial orders issued under a power delegated by the legislature to the Solicitor General under something called the Emergency Program Act. And we concluded that the orders went beyond what the Emergency Program Act authorizes and were therefore contrary to law. And we recommended validating legislation and tighter safeguards to ensure the appropriate role of the legislature in a parliamentary democracy. The report's core point is rule of law protection, even in emergency. Every exercise of public power must have a clear legal source and be proportionate. Otherwise, people's democratic rights to lawful process and participation in governance are at risk. Next slide, please. So Friedman is, I expect for most of us, our touchstone. It's a tremendous endorsement by Canada's highest court of law, but it frames our powers modestly, and therefore the court gave us a wide berth to do our work. But there's another way to look at our offices, and that found expression in a 2019 judgment of the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal. And it describes the role of an ombuds in a more robust fashion. The Ombudsman's authority is a potent force which acts as a part of a system of legislative checks and balances on the proper functioning of our democratic institutions. The Ombudsman's oversight reminds both government and its bureaucracy that they, like the citizens they serve, are bound by the rule of law and will be held to account for its breach. So as I said, when we released Extraordinary Times, Extraordinary Measures, every exercise of public authority in a democratic system must find its source in law. And our role as an ombuds is to test governments and institutions' decisions and actions against standards of fairness. And that includes acting in a manner that respects and protects the rights of people in society. And it's our role to shine a light on failures to do that and to prompt fixes when governments don't measure up. Thank you. I look forward to answering questions once the rest of the panel has spoken.
Thank you very much, Jay. Intersection of fairness and rights, very thoughtful comments again, of course. I like the checks and balances concept to define our role. So our third speaker in the panel is none other than our host, Paul Dubé. Paul is an accomplished lawyer and avid defender of rights and current president of the North American chapter of the International Ombudsman Institute. Please welcome Paul as he joins us to speak on how to best use international standards and principles.
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you, Brad, for setting the table for this in such an eloquent way. Friends, the Ombudsman Institution has existed for over 200 years with the aim of strengthening democracy and promoting and protecting fundamental rights. But it's only in the past few years that we've had international standards that define, promote, and protect the role of the Ombudsman Institution. So why do we need them? What do these standards say? How do they benefit us? And how can we use them to our advantage in the interest of protecting our institutions. This is a topic that could be discussed for hours, and I'll do my best in the time I have to go through them, and I'll apologize in advance for flying through several slides. Next slide, please. So with apologies to Benjamin Franklin, in my experience, it is a certainty that some institutions and schemes, ombudsman institutions and schemes, are inevitably going to come under threat in some way, somewhere, from time to time. I've seen this myself, having held 2 ombudsman roles, as well as through my involvement with the Canadian Council of Parliamentary Ombudsman, the IOI, the Forum of Canadian Ombudsmen, and you just heard a really compelling example of that from Brad. And as Rob Behrens said at the beginning of this session, these are dangerous times. So what do we mean by threats? What are we talking about when we speak of ombudsman under threat? Next slide, please. Well, what if the department or agencies that you oversee had the power to control your work and determine outcomes? What if politicians controlled who could complain to the ombudsman, as well as how and when? What if the government took steps to silence you or remove you from office or prevent you from being able to fulfill your role effectively? What if your funding was controlled by the agency that you oversee, or cut so dramatically that it prevented you from being able to function properly? What if you didn't have security of tenure and could be dismissed without cause? What would you do? Would you know what options are available to you? So these questions are based on real-world examples. For example, Poland's government-controlled constitutional tribunal ruled in April of 2021 that the country's human rights ombudsman should be removed from his post. It criticized the government's takeover of a newspaper, and the move was seen as yet another attempt by the Warsaw government to exert control over independent institutions and remove its most strident critics. Next slide, please. Here in Canada, Canadian Armed Forces officials refused to give the military ombudsman basic data so he could help soldiers, forcing him to file access to information requests to obtain records from the Defense Department. And at the same time, the Department of National Defense was dragging its heels on approving travel for ombudsman staff to conduct investigations. In fact, it took 4 attempts to convince the deputy minister to approve a request for $620 so that the ombudsman and a staff member could travel to Halifax to meet with military personnel as part of an investigation. And my office has not been immune to threats to its independence either. In 2018, the government introduced Bill 57, which contained a clause that the government could suspend any officer of the legislature without cause, without notice, or without compensation. So I wrote to the Premier, and as Brad alluded to, I had the support of CCPO, IOI, and FCO in writing to protest this threat to the independence of our office. And having the support of national and international ombuds organizations to denounce the proposed legislative changes was effective, and fortunately the clause was removed. And of course, you've heard Brad Moss tell his compelling story of courage and principle, and there are many examples we could give, but you get the idea. The threats to independence and effectiveness often arise, and in many forms. Now, in the parliamentary ombudsman context, threats to independence or operational effectiveness and the ability to hold governments to account really undermine our role in democracy. And even if the existence of the ombudsman is not threatened, its system or authority may be less than ideal. It may have weaknesses, or it may not conform to best practices. For example, it may not have the power to initiate own motion investigations. So the incumbent may wish to present a compelling case for enhancements or improvements based on internationally recognized principles. So it was after many examples of ombudsmen being targeted or weakened by governments around the world that the Council of Europe's Venice Commission created a set of principles in 2019 to protect the independence, the effectiveness, and the integrity of ombudsman institutions around the world. They arose from growing concerns that some governments were undermining ombudsmen through political interference, budget cuts, or restrictions on their mandate. They are, as we know, named the Venice Principles. In 1992, the United Nations adopted the Paris Principles, which established the internationally recognized minimum standards for human rights institutions. Well, ombuds wanted something similar. And so the Venice Principles were created in March of 2019 by the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe. And they set out the fundamental legal principles essential to the establishment of independent and impartial ombudsman institutions. They've been described as the democratic ABCs for ombudsman institutions. And so these principles establish international standards that define what makes an ombudsman institution credible and effective, such as independence from government, adequate funding, broad investigatory powers, and accessibility to the public. In essence, the Venice Principles were designed to safeguard the ombudsman's ability to hold public authorities accountable, ensuring that these institutions can operate freely and impartially in defense of human rights, good governance, and the rule of law. For example, one of the most important provisions of the Venice Principles is Article 24, which calls on states to refrain from hindering or suppressing the effective functioning of the ombudsman institution. So the Venice Principles were a great step forward, but a declaration only by the Council of Europe might have limited reach. But what if a global institution put forward a complementary set of principles that reinforced the Venice Principles? Well, thankfully, we have that. The UN resolution on the role of ombudsman and mediator institutions was created to recognize and strengthen the global importance of ombudsman offices in promoting good governance, accountability, and human rights. In addition to affirming the ombudsman's essential role in upholding the rule of law and public trust in government, it was intended to align international support around the standards set out in the Venice Principles. In other words, to spread the adoption and support of these principles beyond Europe and North America. So adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2020, it also responded to increasing threats to independence and security of ombudsman institutions in some countries. The resolution urges all UN members to protect and support ombudsman offices, ensuring that they have independence and resources and the authority they need to operate effectively and without interference. So, for example, it strongly encourages member states to consider the creation or the strengthening of independent, autonomous ombudsman and mediator institutions. And it says, it suggests to do that consistent with the principles in the Venice Principles. The Venice Principles are the global standards to be observed for the establishment and proper functioning of an ombudsman and for the safeguarding of its independence and legitimacy. And the UN resolution complements those standards. So with that, the question becomes, how can we leverage these declarations of international principles within the Venice Principles and the UN resolution to address threat situations or even perhaps to lobby for improvements? Well, I would say that the first step is to know them. And I would point to the fact that I identify three key principles in each document. Under the Venice Principles, the first principle is that the institution must be independent with a firm legal foundation. Secondly, that states must refrain from actions that undermine its independence. And third, that the institution must have sufficient financial, administrative, and human resources. With respect to the UN resolution, it says that member states are encouraged to establish or strengthen independent and autonomous ombuds institutions. Secondly, that states should ensure adequate resources and guarantee their independence. And finally, the resolution refers explicitly to the Venice Principles as the relevant international principles guiding the functioning of ombudsman and mediator institutions. So I would sum up each document with those three principles, although there are more. And so step two, Rob alluded to this earlier, our institutions are not widely known or understood across society despite our ongoing outreach efforts. Well, the internationally recognized principles that define us are even more obscure to governments and the public. So that is why I began proactively educating and informing government about them as soon as they were created. I wanted the legislature and legislators to be aware of these principles in case they got some ideas that they wanted to mess around with our legislation or debilitate organization. So I personally undertook to proactively raise awareness and put government and our funding body and all stakeholders on notice that they exist. I began referencing them in my annual reports, my budget submissions, social and legacy media, on our website, in presentations, and in direct communications with elected officials. And so if an ombudsman does face attempts to suppress or hinder its work, these principles are there to be used. And I'll share a few examples quickly of how that has happened in the past. So again, I've referenced Article 24, which calls on states to refrain from hindering or suppressing the effective functioning of the Ombudsman institution. This is something that can be invoked when a government attempts to obstruct an ombudsman. Well, in 2020, the Guatemalan human rights ombudsman person was under threat and facing removal from office. He had used the LGBTQ flag on social media to show support for the rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people in his country, which has no comprehensive non-discrimination legislation protecting LGBTQ people. So on July 6th of 2020, the legislature's Human Rights Commission summoned the ombudsperson to a plenary session of Congress to be held accountable for his activities in office and the actions taken during his tenure, all because of his public statements in support of LGBTQ rights. The IOI wrote a letter of support of the ombudsperson referencing Article 24 of the Venice Principles, and this intervention greatly helped the ombudsperson. The government backed down, and he continued in office for another 2 years. The principle of stable and adequate funding is to ensure true independence from authorities that the ombudsman oversees. There should be sufficient resources for the ombudsman to operate, and the ombudsman institution should have flexibility, structural flexibility, and sufficient staff. Well, here at Ombudsman Ontario, we have invoked sections 21 and 22 before the Board of Internal Economy when it was proposed to reduce our budget by 18% in 2023. This action, among others, enabled us to obtain adequate funding for the fiscal year. And then last year, after waiting 9 months for the approval of our budgetary estimates, I sent the Board of Internal Economy a letter with the Venice Principles and the UN resolution attached. And I'm happy to say that we received approval of our budget estimates shortly after sending the letter. So step 4, well, I really don't have time to go into this aspect in depth, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the great work, the potential that peer review has to help promote compliance with the principles and standards that I've discussed. And Rob Behrens and Peter Tyndall have done great groundbreaking work in the UK, exploring how peer assessment reviews could be used to urge governments to bolster ombudsman offices and provide it with the legislative foundation and operational resources necessary to comply with the Venice Principles and the UN resolution. I note also that the New Zealand Ombudsman has done some work on this. So all I can tell you right now is that the IOI is sponsoring a practice paper. Work on this continues, but it has a lot of promise. So stay tuned. I think that the ability to call on an organization like the IOI to come in, do an assessment, and comment on how well your organization complies or conforms with the Venice Principles and UN resolution could be a real powerful tool to bolstering the independence and ensuring the functionality of the office. So this was a very brief presentation. I kind of flew through it a bit, but I hope you find it instructive, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Paul. It's sometimes so easy to take for granted that our office is not at risk or even susceptible to risk. However, the current global context reminds us that no one is immune to changes in government, philosophy, or paradigm, which can sometimes lead to troubling developments. So thank you for reminding us all. Our last speaker of the day is Ombudsman of the Canadian province of Prince Edward Island, Sandy Hermiston, and in fact, the province's first ever ombuds. Sandy comes to us with over 35 years of public service experience, having served in different offices across the country and the world. In addition to being a friend and an outstanding colleague, Sandy is a wonderful blend of rigor and determination combined with profound humanity. She's here today to talk to us about the value of collaboration, defining relationships. Sandy, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Nadine, for that kind introduction. And again, thank you to Paul for including me in this wonderful celebration of 50 years of Ombuds in Ontario. I would like to acknowledge that I am currently on the unceded Mi'kmaq territory known as Ebikwit, and we are covered by a historic treaties of peace and friendship. And I pay my respect to the Mi'kmaq people who have occupied this island for 12,000 years. So we've talked about dealing with complainants. We've talked about really big ideas involved with protecting rights and how to respond to threats, and then, of course, the Venice Principles and the UN resolution. And I'm going to bring it back to something a little bit more local and talk about defining relationships in terms of collaboration. If I could have the next slide, please. So Ombuds PEI was created in 2022. We're the newest parliamentary ombuds office in Canada, and we have 5 staff members, including me. Next slide, please. For context, you can see where we're located. We're a little tiny island and the smallest province in Canada. Prior to being the ombuds here, I was the ombuds in the Cayman Islands, and PEI is 21 times bigger than the Cayman Islands. So that's a little fun fact about my island hopping. Although the population in PEI is only 2 times bigger than in the Cayman Islands. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk about the definition of collaboration. To collaborate is to work jointly with other people in an intellectual endeavor, and to cooperate with someone else to an agency which is not immediately connected. What I want to make really clear is that we are not collaborating with the enemy. And a lot of people would be concerned about a collaborative approach being too friendly with the department or public entity that you are investigating. And I want to make it very clear that when we talk about collaboration, we talk about it with boundaries, of course. And we want to safeguard our investigative process and our independence in all of the work that we do. Next slide. Brené Brown is a leading thinker on ideas like collaboration. And she says that it requires daring leadership from everyone on the team. It means having tough conversations, staying curious, and learning how to listen. And I think that is one of the most important skills that we bring to the kind of work that we do. We have to listen to complainants, but we also have to listen to authorities and be really curious about what their concerns are and how they work. Next slide, please. So how do we do that? We use all the soft skills that we need in order to do the kind of work that we do, because we have no ability to make anyone do anything. So we need to create an environment where we listen, we learn, we build trust, we communicate, and we share credit, because that's how we're going to get our work done. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about a file that in Canada you've heard lots about. I've talked about it with my parliamentary ombuds colleagues, as well as with the Federation of Canadian Ombudsmen. But it is really an illustration of the kind of approach that we have. So we had a case in the very 4 months into the office being open, 1 week into actually having staff in the office other than me, and we were able to take that complaint. It was a series of complaints, take those complaints in, and in 9 months come to a resolution. And we did that by collaborating with the entity we were investigating. Next slide, please. We did that by sitting down and introducing ourselves. And when we introduce ourselves here on PEI, because our office is so new, we have to educate them. Ombuds 101, as Brad said, and what Paul said in terms of using some of the tools that we have to talk about the powers. We talk about legislation, like Jay referred to, in terms of all of the powers that we have and the context in which we work. Then we sat down and had a meeting about the issues and barriers, and we explored those. We did research because we recognized that the entity we were investigating did not have the capability in terms of staff to look at some of the issues in detail. So we did our own research, and we did jurisdictional scans, and we looked at things like medical standards of care to offer to help them understand the issue and why we were concerned. We sat down with them, met with them in person, which is one of the most important types of interactions that I think you can have. I think that we've gone so far away from that interpersonal communication that we lose the ability to solve our problems sometimes when we hide behind emails and Teams chats. So we sat down and we talked to them, and we explored their concerns, and we explored some of the barriers that they had, or they felt they had. Then we put together a written assessment, and what we did was tell a story to them. We told the story we heard from them and from the complainants, and we reflected it back, and we said, here's what we've heard, here's what we've learned, and we want to talk to you about the things that have come to our attention. And we sat down with them, and we had some very hard conversations about how it was going to look if these problems weren't solved, in our opinion. And I think they came to understand when we reflected to them what the issues could be, that it might be worth talking about finding a solution. And so they went back and they said, look, we see what you're talking about. Let us go and look at what we might be able to do. And we said, off you go, fine with us. Then they came back to us and they said, we have a proposed solution. The solution was, the solution was not what we expected, but a really good one in our opinion. So we said, that's a great solution. Let's write a report now. We drafted a report that left out a lot of detail about the hurdles we had getting to the answer, and instead talked about the problem, talked about the answer, and made a pronouncement about whether we were satisfied with their solution. And we circulated drafts, we had lots of conversations about what we were going to say, and then eventually issued our final report. Next slide, please. In terms of the barriers, the roadblocks, then the difficult conversations we had along the way, it was a question of opioid replacement therapy. And they were not providing opioid replacement therapy at all in the prison. They were providing withdrawal management and then allowing people to go on opioid replacement therapy 6 weeks before they were released. So in the interim, they withdrew and didn't deal with the issues that were caused by opioid use, and then were sort of left feeling uncomfortable in their lack of treatment for their opioid use disorder, and instead waited till 6 weeks before they were released in order to get the treatment that they probably should have had all the way along. And so one of the things that was part of the problem was that the doctors involved in this whole system were very concerned that we were questioning their medical judgment. So we had some very tense meetings with doctors who came in quite loaded with opinions about what we were trying to do. And we sat and listened to them, and we let them let us have it. And then we sat back and we said, actually, that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is make sure that the policy that's in existence in the jail isn't preventing you from practicing medicine and from using the standards that are appropriate for treatment for opioid use disorder. Got the doctors right on side. They understood that that's the barrier that we saw, and they became advocates in terms of what we were trying to do. The correctional center said, we don't want to reward behavior because these inmates did some things in order to get their complaints some attention, and we don't want to reward what they did. And so we had to deal with that and say, okay, so maybe what we do is we don't talk about how it got to us, and that we leave that part of the story out and just focus on the fact that there were complaints. And we also reassured them if there was a new policy in place, that the people who had complained, we did not expect them to automatically receive opioid replacement therapy. What we expected to happen was that the, can you go to the next slide, please? Because all of this is on that next slide. What we expected was that they would use the policy and apply it fairly to determine whether those people who had complained were entitled to opioid replacement therapy. And then another concern in the jail was that they would use the Suboxone that was normally prescribed for opioid replacement therapy as bargaining within the jail. And we told them that we understood that concern, but that everywhere else in Canada was dealing with that, and there were probably some solutions if they looked around. What they came back to us with was that there was an injectable form called Sublocade that they could give to inmates that wouldn't require issuing pills every day. Now, it wasn't the only thing, because sometimes that injection wouldn't be appropriate and they would still have to use Sublocade in certain occasions, or Suboxone on certain occasions. But we said, that's a great solution. Wow, we wouldn't have thought of that. Way to go. So we listened to what they had to say. We challenged them to make sure that it wasn't okay to just say, oh, it's going to be hard. Yeah, we know it's going to be hard, but that's actually not a real barrier to what we need to get to. So got through all of those barriers and we issued a report. And I'm going to go to the next slide, please. And we can talk about some of the wording in our report where we applauded them in terms of the steps that they took to close the gap in a responsible way. We recognized that the correctional staff had thankless jobs, and that it was really important that they treat inmates well. We acknowledged that they were willing to adapt and adjust and put new treatments and protocols into place. We said thank you for the cooperation that they showed us, and for the work that they do every day. And then we also said we're confident that the inmates will now have access to a standard of care that is proven to be most effective, setting them up to say, we're watching you and we're confident that going forward, this is going to continue. So that report was issued. It was 10 pages long. It told a story. It told how the problem was solved. And we bought a lot of goodwill with that, because we got to a place where the complaints were resolved without having to air a bunch of dirty laundry, and build some reputation as a collaborative office that was focused on solving problems. Based on that, in fact, while that was all going on, we had a number of other complaints that we were dealing with. But because we had such a good working relationship with them, we were able to solve complaints about a strip search, 3 inmates strip search together, contrary to any written policy. And we called them up and we said, this doesn't sound right. And they said, no, you're right. Doesn't sound right. They agreed to give written apologies to all 3 inmates, and they did some staff training in order to make sure that people understood what the strip search criteria would be and how they would be implemented. We had problems with telephone access that we were able to resolve along the way during this whole investigation. So what this did was build a working relationship that allowed us to get in and solve problems without too much formality, and get the job done in a small place. I'm really conscious, I know I'm rushing, but I'm really conscious that we're over our time, and so I'm just going to keep moving on. Here's the next slide is another example of the kinds of collaboration that we do. The other day we got an email from our tax person, provincial tax commissioner, when we reached out about a tax issue, and the response was, I'm going to be submitting a request to our legal services about whether you can investigate, and your section of your act seems to say that you can't, and if you have any comments, you can submit them along to me with, and I'll give them to our lawyer. We responded, thank you for engaging with us on your jurisdictional related question. As is often the case, our ability to consider this complaint is slightly more complicated than may first appear. To introduce ourselves and the work of our office, and to provide more detail on how we consider this matter, we would like to meet with you and whoever else you think is appropriate at a time and location of your preference. We would be happy to host you here or come to your office if you prefer. 15 minutes later, thank you, reiterate, not trying to be difficult, We want to do our due diligence. How's Tuesday? So that's the kind of collaborative, informal approach that we take to the work that we do. And we're finding that in this small jurisdiction, that is a very effective way for us to get our job done. And I'm not trying to infer that it would work in large offices. I don't know, because my specialty is small offices. But I would like to think that there are some aspects of that approach that could be implemented in larger offices. Next slide. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. As you know, I'm a firm believer in the collaborative approach. We definitely share this philosophy, and I feel very strong about the impact that this kind of approach has on your chances of success of producing an effective and durable result, and the upside of maintaining future useful channels. So thank you for this. This concludes our second panel of the day. I will now invite Brad, Paul, Jay, and Sandy all back on the screen for questions. Excuse me. Remember that you can submit question, and I'm turning as we speak to the Q&R. So I'll just go with and to all of you, what steps should ombudsman's offices, in your opinion, take today to ensure they remain trusted, independent, and effective 50 years from now?
Well, I'll jump in there. If I would say that it's important to demonstrate value every day, to seize every opportunity to demonstrate to all stakeholders why we are beneficial and actually indispensable to them. So to the public, we can shine a light on the situations they're facing, either resolve an individual complaint or address a systemic problem. For public sector bodies or government agencies, we can help them arrive at better policies and procedures that will reduce the number of complaints that they may have to deal with, improve morale. I think that it's been my observation, most public servants go to work every day wanting to do a good job, and we don't often find problems that they're not aware of. And so if we can help them work in that way that Sandy alluded to, collaborative, I like to speak of appropriate but productive relationships. That oversight does not have to be adversarial, and so we let them set the tone. But I just come back to demonstrating value every day, showing people what we can do. And to Jay's point, it's more than just service. We are uniquely positioned to help defend people's rights, and I think that that's a real vital aspect of the Ombudsman institution that needs to be reinforced.
And if I could add, Paul, that in a brand new office, we have to probably we think about it and talk about it a little more often. But I note that in Ontario and BC and Newfoundland, your offices have been around for 50 years, 45 years. You're still talking about it. So you should never, ever, ever stop talking about those important principles. And that's really fundamental to ensuring that we maintain our reputation of integrity as well.
I say we have to be in outreach mode constantly. Even if we've been around for a while, our mandates change. We have additions. We have new interest groups that we serve from time to time, and so the public awareness of what we do is low, and so I think it's incumbent upon us to be in outreach mode all the time.
And I think that may I add that I think you can definitely demonstrate your value even when criticizing administration or a department. I think you can do it in such a way that something positive can come out of the process.
Nadine, if I might just add, one thing we didn't talk about was the fact that we exist in order to improve the public trust in government. And we need to be mindful of that and how we conduct ourselves, which comes back to your point and mine about collaboration. There's a way of getting to a result without tearing them down and causing complete doubt in the system.
Yeah, I agree.
I think
I think it's about playing the long game, especially in smaller jurisdictions where relationships matter. And yes, you stand your ground when the time comes for you to do it. But especially with new staff coming in, you know, they'll bring me something that they want to send out, and I say, whoa, you know, like it'll feel really good when you put it in the mail, but you know, we're just remember we have to deal with this organization on, you know, numerous other files going forward. So it's really about establishing relationships, key relationships, and fostering and maintaining those as incumbents come and go. And
I think
yes,
the only other piece that I would add is just the critical importance of independence. That that means independence, not just from public authorities, but from complainants. We're not advocates, and we become advocates. We become like a million other public bodies out there, or sorry, a million other NGOs and stakeholders out there in the world. What gives us influence to improve public administration is that we're starting not from a predisposition, we're starting from a, you know, an impartial place, and we go where, you know, the facts lead us. And there's a lot of push to align with others always. And I think it's just critically important for our offices to, of course, maintain independence from public authorities. And that's a challenge every day, as Paul outlined, and Brad. But also maintaining that independent role from everybody is so critically important if we're going to remain influential.
I couldn't agree more, Jay. And you know, we're not lobbyists in chief, and we have to, and you know, in our situation, we have to reinforce that we don't only have to be independent of government. We have to be independent of interest groups and lobbyists and people who want to advance their own interests, for sure.
It's very difficult to reestablish trust between a citizen and the administration if you're trashing or setting the house on fire. If you're trashing the administration, you can give back trust to the complainant. So you have to be balanced in criticizing and asking for change. So we do have a question. What approaches do you think are most appropriate for advocating for improvements to ombuds legislation or getting better alignment with the Venice principles? Oh, that is the question.
To me, that it brings me back to the value proposition, right? That explaining why a strong and independent ombudsman institution is in everyone's interest, you know, from the public service to the government to citizens.
I guess I would just a sort of procedural or structural question to amending an Ombuds Act is, while statutes are assigned to a minister of the Crown, or in British Columbia, the Ombudsperson acts assigned to the Attorney General, it's my view that we should do what we can to ensure that amendments to our statute come from the legislative branch, not from the executive branch. I think it's, or at least have a high level of involvement of legislators. Because I think that there are so many pressures on governments these days that it's hard for them sometimes to maintain a clear focus on the higher value of an ombuds office. And I think that you know, working with legislators to kind of have those suggestions come forward from them is probably better in the long run.
Couldn't agree more. And we've been doing that recently, reminding the government that we're a democratic institution, not a government department or a government program that they can be stepping into to mess around with the legislation from time to time to please voters or to make themselves popular.
Any other comments from our speakers? So this will conclude the International Ombudsman Symposium. I thank you all for allowing me to be your moderator today. I hope I speak for all of us when I say that I've learned much from the deep expertise of our presenters and from the thoughtful questions of our audience members. I am leaving feeling inspired, invigorated, and eager to put into practice some of the excellent learnings from today. And before we depart, of course, I'd like to pass the mic to our host, Paul, to say some final words. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nadine. And friends, this has been a first for us. And I can't stress how much I am grateful for everybody's participation. My sincere thanks to Nadine for running this show for us today, to the tremendous collaborators and presenters, and to all of you for joining us from around the world to make this what I feel has been a truly enriching discussion. So you've honored us with your contributions and your participation. I was delighted to see representatives from Ombudsman institutions from across 6 continents register for today's event and to help us mark this significant milestone in our organization's history. So for some of you, it's nearing midnight. For others, it's early morning. Wherever you are, I just deeply appreciate the time that you've taken to be with us today. I hope that you leave today encouraged by the knowledge that we are aware of and actively addressing the challenges facing our democratic institutions. May you also feel inspired by the understanding that together we can share better practices. I'll use that term now, Greg. Better practices and celebrate our success and look ahead to a promising future. I'd like to close with a quote from the American historian Gary Wills, who wrote, "Accountability is the essence of democracy." So those of you who have seen our work lead to changes in policy and legislation know this to be true, as do the bodies that sometimes feel most challenged by our powers of discovery and investigation. But this is why we must never grow complacent and why we must remain current with the international standards, principles, and tools that protect and strengthen our institutions. And I think discussions like we've had today are essential. And once again, as I often do, I will endorse the comments of Rod Behrens, who say we must be collegial. We must stick together. So it's been a pleasure to learn from all of you today. And again, thank you very much. Be well, everybody.